Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and accomplished professional from Cairo, Egypt, Mr. Osahon Akpata. Osahon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh.
Osahon is the Chief Executive Officer of CANEX Creations Incorporated. He brings a strong desire to win, analytic skills, and extensive networks to turn business plans into reality. So, my first question for you, you have moved between finance, consulting, and the creative economy. What has consistently driven your personal need to win across such different arenas?
Thank you for the question and for having me on the show, Ashutosh. If I strip it right back, the thing that's driven me across these worlds is the same impulse, the need to turn ideas into reality. For example, while in consulting, my role was fundamentally about solving hard problems and then staying close enough to the work to make sure that the solutions actually landed. I wasn't satisfied with just diagnosing issues on slides, but translating the insight into action. That meant prioritizing what mattered, allocating resources, managing risk, and driving execution until results showed up in the real world. When I moved into this role, focused on the creative economy and other IP-intensive industries, I realized I was using the exact same muscle. The raw materials changed from business cases to stories and intellectual properties, but the question stayed consistent. How do we go from creative idea to product or service that can be monetized? I've always been less interested in elegant theory than in practical outcomes. And that bias towards execution has been the consistent thread across everything that I've done.
Well said. Many people talk about building Africa's creative economy, but few take personal commercial risk. What level of risk do you believe leaders must personally absorb to win at scale?
Well, there cannot be any reward without some level of risk. And I think that the scale in outcomes only comes when you're willing to move beyond the narrative and absorb real risk, not recklessly, but deliberately. For example, the first film investment we made at CANEX Creations is a film, Muganga, about the life of Congolese physician Dr. Denis Mukwege, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work advocating against sexual violence as a weapon of war. The conventional wisdom would be that this is a controversial topic. And while the cause of the films, the cause that the film supports is worthy, it would not resonate with audiences. However, the opposite has been the case. Angelina Jolie came on board as a producer, as she aligned with the cause, and she has worked along with Dr. Mukwege for over a decade on this topic. Since its release in late September, the film has exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Against early skepticism from industry pundits, Muganga has recorded over 300,000 cinema entries in France, generating over 3 million euros in the box office. Even more strikingly, it has maintained the highest audience rating of any film since its release. In Africa's creative economy, it's easy to talk about potential when you're not the one who has to sign the term sheets or commit capital or stand behind projects before there's proof. What I've learned is that credibility at scale comes from being exposed. You have to be willing to take on some calculated risk while doing so what you can to protect against the downsides. That doesn't mean betting blindly. I believe leaders must do hard work upfront to structure the downside protection, to align incentives, and build systems that can survive volatility, while still accepting that you're personally responsible if things don't go according to plan. So for me, winning at scales means putting enough skin in the game that failure would be uncomfortable, but not fatal.
Do you believe the desire to win can be taught, or is it fundamentally intrinsic?
Well, I believe the capacity to win is universal, but the expression of a strong, sustained desire to win is shaped very much by environment as much as it is by one's temperament. In other words, it's neither purely intrinsic nor fully teachable. However, it is something that can be cultivated. From working with teams over the past 3 decades in my career, I found that people differ in their baseline traits linked to competitiveness and achievement. However, the desire to win can be context-driven. If you have not experienced the situations where the effort that you put in resulted in visible payoff, you may not have competitive instincts. When I was a little boy, I read a lot and started writing stories in notebooks. It had to come out from somewhere, I guess. I mean, I was putting so much in. When I moved from individual short stories to writing a detective storybook for children, my parents encouraged me to hone my craft. And that meant endless hours of writing and rewriting. I'm dating myself here, but I learned to use a typewriter at age 10. Some of the audience wonders, what is that, a typewriter? Anyway, the payoff was that I published a book when I was 11 years old. And the rewards from this were so compelling that it instilled in me a very strong desire to do the work, to have such outcomes or wins.
Very interesting. What is the most demanding strategic battle you have fought so far? And what did it teach you about yourself?
That's a tough one. Perhaps the most demanding strategic battle I've fought was establishing CANEX Creations Incorporated as a credible, commercially driven IP investment platform within a development finance institution. There was no real template to go with. There are not so many institutional investors focused on the creative and other IP-focused industries on the continent. So we were asking bankers, lawyers, trade finance experts, and others who are used to dealing with more tangible industries like commodities and agriculture to take seriously intellectual property. And that's a class that sits at the intersection of culture, innovation, and capital. What made it demanding was the need to balance speed with institutional rigor and conviction with humility, particularly when early results really mattered disproportionately. It was like building a plane and flying it at the same time. I had to persuade stakeholders while constructing the underlying machinery, the governance, the pipelines, the guidelines, frameworks, and all the risk controls. What I learned about myself is that I operate best when I have a clear strategic North Star and the freedom to be creative on how I achieve it. I also learned to be impatient with myself while being patient with others. The experience tested my ability to persuade, educate, and build consensus, to bring people along rather than to push them.
Well said. How do you personally measure success when working on long cycle value creation, such as intellectual property?
Well, when you're working with long cycle assets like intellectual property, success can be measured in short-term financial returns, especially in the early stages. Since we're still a startup at CANEX Creations, our operations just began a few months ago. I focus more on whether the right foundations are being put in place across three horizons. First, durability. Even at this stage, has the IP been structured in a way that allows it to live beyond a single project or release? That means thinking early about multiple monetization windows, cross-platform potential, and the ability for the asset to travel across borders while retaining its core identity. Second, economic integrity and ownership. A key measure of success for me is whether African ownership of IP has been preserved and strengthened, while the rights have been properly structured, protected, and monetized. If the early cash flows are modest but transparent, disciplined, and aligned with long-term value creation, there's a sign that we're in the right direction. Then third, optionality and appreciation. Good IP should create future choices. If an asset begins to show credible pathways for sequels, licensing, adaptations, then value is being created, even though those options may not be fully exercised yet. Over time, success is reflected when the IP appreciates in value rather than exhausts itself.
You bring a disciplined commercial lens to creative industries. What analytical mistakes do you see most often when creativity meets capital?
There's a famous saying that nobody knows anything in the film business, and it captures an important truth. No one can predict with certainty which creative project will break through and which wouldn't. The mistake comes when that uncertainty is used as an excuse to abandon discipline altogether.
Right.
One of the most common analytical errors I see is confusing the unpredictability of the creative industry with uninvestibility. Since those outcomes can be forecast with precision, people either rely too heavily on instinct and hype, or they import some foreign models that assume a certain level of certainty the creative industry simply cannot deliver. Both approaches miss the point. Another frequent mistake is analyzing these projects in isolation rather than as part of a portfolio. Creativity is inherently volatile at single asset levels, which is exactly why you need portfolio thinking across genres, formats, markets, time horizons. Otherwise, you will be, taking too much risk in one single asset. Too often, capital is deployed as if that project must be guaranteed to hit, instead of trying to put everything together in a structure that allows you to absorb the variance and upside for potential growth. I also see this tendency to undervalue the rights and life cycle. The focus is often on immediate performance rather than on ownership and control of intellectual property and the ability to monetize across multiple windows over time. That short-term framing often leads to decisions that look sensible in the moment, but sacrifice long-term value. A good counterexample is the deal that the American director Ryan Coogler recently struck for his latest film, Sinners. He recognized that he was creating durable intellectual property and negotiated for the rights to revert to him after a few years. The decision reflects a long-term view. Even after its initial release cycle, the film will continue to hold value. The fact that Sinners went on to break records with 16 Oscar nominations only reinforces how powerful that foresight was. My view is that capital must engage with creativity more intelligently by accepting uncertainty, pricing risk properly, and building structures that allow great deals to create value over time.
Great response. Many business plans look compelling on paper. What analytical red flags immediately tell you that execution will fail?
Well, there are a few. And, I would say the first one is the unrealistic scaling. When I see a plan that has very outlandish projections, and people just say, give us the money and we'll grow the revenues many times over in a short time frame, that's a red flag. The second one is the lack of credible partners. As an entrepreneur, one has to understand that you can't do everything by yourself. You need to have the right partners to be able to do certain things. Otherwise, you won't get very far. The third is the poor accountability for delivery. If I see a lack of clarity on whom is responsible to deliver what, and that's a big challenge. You can tell that it's not going to end well in that plan. And then I suppose the fourth one would be misaligned incentives. There has to be very clear motivation for all the parties involved to do what is required to get the desired outcomes.
Well said. When you are evaluating an IP-driven opportunity, what are the first three variables you analyze before you commit your time or your capital?
When I look at an IP-driven opportunity, especially as the subsidiary of a Pan-African development finance institution, I start with three variables that sit upstream of valuation and forecasts. First is the ownership and control of IP. Before anything else, I need to clarify who owns the rights, how clean the chain of title is, and whether the IP can be protected and enforced over time. If ownership is fragmented or weakly documented, no amount of commercial upside can compensate for that risk, particularly if our mandate includes strengthening African ownership of assets. Second, I look at the pathway for sustainable monetization. I'm less interested in a single hit that will, just make it one time and then that's the end of it. That tells me that the IP has durability when I see the ability for it to make money over a period of time. And then the third is additionality and execution capacity. I ask myself the question, would our capital, our networks, our structuring expertise change the trajectory of this asset? And if it does, then there's a chance of doing something here. If these three variables are sound, I'm willing to invest some more time to deeper analyze this opportunity. But if one of them fails at the outset, execution risk usually overwhelms both commercial and potential development impact.
Amazing. In your view, where do traditional finance models still fail to understand the economics of creativity?
Traditional finance models struggle where creativity refuses to behave like a conventional asset class.
Mm-hmm.
The first gap is variance. Creative outcomes are very highly skewed. Most projects cluster around modest returns, while a few outliers generate disproportionate value. Many finance models are built around normal distributions and average outcomes, which leads to over-penalizing risk or underestimating upside. Creativity doesn't reward linear thinking. It rewards portfolio logic and patience. A classic example is the film industry itself. For every breakout franchise like Star Wars, there are dozens of competent, well-financed films that barely recoup their costs. Traditional finance models often treat each project as if returns should cluster around an average. But Star Wars generated great value, so extreme across films, merchandise, games, and theme parks that it carried an entire studio for several years. That kind of skew is normal in creativity, not an anomaly. The second is time horizon. Finance is often calibrated around near-term cash flows, which creative assets tend to compound over longer cycles. Intellectual property can be under-monetized early and significantly repriced later as audiences, formats, and markets evolve. Models that discount anything that doesn't show immediate traction systematically miss this dynamic. A textbook example of this is the long cycle value of Harry Potter. The early books were successful, but the real economic power emerged years later through films and spin-offs and licensing, theme parks, and generational audience renewal. The short-term cash flow model would have dramatically undervalued what became one of the most lucrative IP portfolios in history.
Absolutely.
Then the third is intangibility. Traditional frameworks are comfortable with physical collateral and predictable demand, but they struggle to price elements like cultural relevance, audience affinity, or long-term brand equity. These are often treated as soft factors, even though they are precisely what drive durability and defensibility of creative assets. And an artist like Beyonce, for example, illustrates how value extends beyond unit sales or tour revenues. Her cultural capital, the trust that she has this beehive, people who follow her, that trust, identity, and audience loyalty allows her to launch albums without any promotion, sell out stadiums, partner selectively with brands while retaining her pricing power. Traditional models struggle to quantify this type of intangible equity, even though it directly translates into economic leverage.
Great response. Osahon, if you were advising a young founder today, what analytical discipline would you insist they master before they raise capital?
Well, there are a few things. I think the first one would be to figure out where the value is in the business that they're talking about. How is it really created? Where's the value really created in the business? The second is to figure out what drives the variance in their revenue model. Is it the customer acquisition? Is it rights ownership? Is it talent costs? Like, they should figure out that lever. And then the third is, why do you want to raise capital? Because capital is not validation, it's responsibility. Having other investors on your cap table means that you're accountable and you need to be disciplined and inspire trust.
Time for 3 more questions for you. What skills do leaders need today to navigate both boardrooms and creative communities without losing authenticity?
I think that being a former strategy consultant and banker, along with being a writer and producer, have given me exposure to both worlds and an ability to navigate in both spaces. The leaders who manage that balance between corporate and creative communities will share 3 core skills, in my view. First is the contextual intelligence, the ability to understand what the different rules value and why. Boardrooms tend to value risk, governance, and accountability, while creative communities are driven by trust, authorship, and belief. Authentic leadership means not diluting yourself to fit into either space, but translating honestly between them. Second is listening with intent. In creative environments, listening is about absorbing the nuances, the emotion, and subtext. In board settings, it's more about pressure testing assumptions and trade-offs. Leaders who listen and learn well to what they're paying attention to, they gain credibility in both worlds because people feel understood and not managed. And then the third is integrity of incentives. Nothing erodes authenticity faster than saying one thing to creators and another thing to capital. Leaders need the skill and courage to align incentives so that creative ambition and commercial discipline are not in conflict. When people see that your decisions hold consistently across rooms, the trust will follow. I believe that leaders that can hold a single set of values while adapting their language and tools to different audiences are the ones that can move fluidly between the boardrooms and the creative communities without losing themselves.
Very interesting. How do you ensure that partnerships remain value creating over time rather than becoming symbolic or political?
Yeah. Partnership management is a whole topic and it's a whole discipline that should be studied in more detail.
Yeah.
I think the first part is that creating the bonds that build the trust between the partners. It cannot be underestimated what it means to have a very strong bond. And that requires time and dialogue and discussion. The second is aligning on the joint term goals. The joint goals that both organizations have and revisiting them periodically to ensure that there's mutual benefit. This is an important part of building these partnerships. And then the third, I would say, is measuring the outputs of the partnership health. One should always be doing maybe even like a partnership report to say, okay, what have we achieved as a group and how's the partnership going? I think these are important.
And my last question for you, Osahon. Looking ahead, what kind of alliances will matter most in turning Africa's intellectual property into a globally competitive asset class?
The alliances that will matter the most are the ones that collapse the distance between Africa and global markets, between creativity and capital, and between talent and infrastructure. First, creator capital alliances grounded in aligned incentives. Africa doesn't lack any ideas. It has plenty. What it lacks is long-term risk capital that understands IP cycles.
Right.
Partnerships where capital is patient, governance is strong, and creators retain their meaningful ownership of their IP is more likely to go somewhere and compound rather than be seen as extractive. For example, we recently co-financed a feature film with a Nigerian investment firm, and we're engaging other co-financing partners interested in the space as we see opportunities to bring capital and creativity together. The second is market access alliances with distributors, platforms, sales agents, and marketplaces that can move African IP across borders at scale. Global competitiveness isn't just about quality, it's about reach, data, and repeatability. Without the strong pipes into these international markets, even the best IP stays local. For example, none of us would have heard about Squid Game if not for Netflix, right? We are strongly pushing for co-productions between African countries and territories outside the continent to extend the reach that our IP has. And we're engaging with global distributors, sales agents, marketplaces, and platforms to expand market access for global African IP. Then the third, institutional alliances that bring credibility and standards. Development finance institutions, multilaterals, and anchor corporates can help crowd in private capital and professionalize an ecosystem through better rights management, reporting, and governance. I'm pleased that both global and Pan-African DFIs are looking very seriously at intervening in the creative industries. These sectors need a lot more institutional players to achieve the desired scale. Finally, inter-African alliances matter just as much. Pan-African co-production, distribution, and licensing platforms are critical to building scale at home before exploring the value abroad. A fragmented continent cannot compete globally as an asset class. We need vibrant domestic markets, and we've seen some successes with music and film from Nigeria, for example. Ultimately, turning African IP into a globally competitive asset class won't be driven by the isolated champions, but by ecosystems and aligned partners, each doing their best to pull everything together in the long term.
Well said. And on that note, I just want to say, Osahon, what a fabulous conversation this has been with you. You gave us a very interesting perspective on finance, on intellectual property, on creative genius of Africa, which is such a huge continent, and there's so much IP that will be developed in the creative area in Africa, I'm sure, in the years to come. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you, Ashutosh.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.